listening to all of you this morning is very inspiring, obviously. But I have to ask this question, I think, as a starting question. I don't want the idea of EarthEd and all that it's comprised of to come across as utopian, but we have to acknowledge that there are going to be significant challenges integrating this broader sustainability and resilience curriculum into schools. So the question for all of you is, how do we integrate CSE, SEL, ecoliteracy into schools that might not see this as a priority, that might even be resistant to it? Anyone can start, because I'm going to ask it to all of you. So.
All right, well, I guess I'm next to Erik, so maybe we could sweep across the table. I'll try to be brief. One great thing about education is that, at least in this country, it isn't true everywhere, but it's pretty much locally controlled. So it actually brings it closer to people from a democratic perspective. If you're trying to change the climate policies of the Donald Trump administration, good luck with that. But if you're trying to change the policies in your own school programs, in your own education programs, you can become active as long as you're old enough to vote. And if you're not old enough to vote, you're probably a student. So you can become active in your own schools, clamoring for change. And I think the process gets a nice kickstart with a book that is entirely devoted to it. So one thing you can do is buy this book and promulgate its considerable wisdom with your friends, your teachers, your parents, people in your community. But I think education particularly, and thinking about education in fresh ways, whether it's CSE or SEL or ecoliteracy, is a great opportunity to get locally active in democratic self-government in your own community. So that'd be an initial comment.
I think the best way to sell this is to have them experience it. When I work with teachers that are skeptical, or administrators that are skeptical, or even school board members that are skeptical, getting them to participate in an exercise of team building or an empathy activity, all of a sudden it becomes like, oh, I see how this applies to everything. It's not so, I think we worry that it's too touchy-feely, but we're relating all of the time, and all learning, happens in relationships. So I think just getting them to practice it themselves and play a little bit, and convinces them really that it's worth slowing down a little bit to take the time to build these types of skills so that you can speed up, not taking so much time for conduct issues and dealing with cultural problems and climate problems in your school, that it actually provides a lot more time for learning. And once they figure that out, it seems like a no-brainer, and there's a lot more buy-in. Hope that answers.
A couple of things. I think that the one notion that how are we going to bring this to all of education? I don't think we will. I don't think there is a we there. I think what's going to happen, and what is happening, is, as Bob was saying, it's local. It's in individual schools. It's in individual districts, and it sometimes begins with, in our experience, with one teacher, one administrator, one student who says, I want something to happen, and then finds the other people to work with, the other people who have that same concern, and begin to build that. I think the other thing is that it's, people do learn when they see what else is happening. We talk in systems thinking, we talk about that a system can never be directed, it can only be disturbed. And so one of the ways that to bring about this kind of change is by disturbing systems. And systems can be disturbed in all sorts of ways. They can be disturbed by the introduction of new knowledge, the introduction of new ideas, different people, different organizational ways of structuring things, so that there are a lot of ways to create the kind of situations in which the emergence of new forms is possible. And I think that that's, as far as I can tell, to the degree it's going to happen, that's how it's going to happen.
Let's take our first question from the local audience.
Do I need, oh, there we go. Thank you. So I think this is mostly a question for Pamela, although I would love to hear from all of you about it. So I'm wondering about ideas for, in a moment, wanting to reach somebody with a new idea, wanting even the chance to persuade them, ideas about how to cut through the fear response in another person, however it shows up, as defensiveness, as self-protection, as every kind of wariness. Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of a difficult time hearing you, and
Okay.
I'm.
Should I say it again, louder?
So you're asking, let me just see, you're asking what are some tools or ways to cut through the defensiveness when you're trying to.
Yes, and in the moment, like before you get to the program, like when you're
Right.
just talking to somebody
Yeah.
or a group of people, whoever it is, and you feel like you have something useful to share that's different and new. Ideas about how, wow, I got a lot louder there. Ideas about how to reach them when they're feeling self-protective.
Yeah. It's interesting because I deal with this a lot with groups of students who, I mentioned in my talk, this predator-prey dynamic, and you look at these kids and they seem so harsh and defensive and like they're tuning you out. And it's really, once I started sort of practicing, just this sort of unconditional positive regard towards them, and build that. It takes time, a little bit of time to build relationship, but in that moment, I really did notice when I was sending that I could, and saying, I see your fear, because that's usually where the defensiveness lies, that in that connection, you can lower that a little bit. One of the things, just what that does to you inside yourself, I don't know if it's the same thing that happens with me, but I get sort of hijacked when I meet that defensiveness. And we actually use a tool there's a group called 6 Seconds. It's an emotional intelligence network, and a lot of, it's some of my early work in understanding this work came from them, but they have this thing called the 6-second pause. And I teach this to every group of teachers and every group of students, and I know Amy does as well. But it's really just, stopping in that moment when you get that emotional reaction, considering what your intention is, how do you show up in your best self, and sort of taking that time between the stimulus of their defensiveness and your response. And you can't determine how they're going to act, but it does tend to have a calming effect on you. I'd love to talk more with you about it.
Thank you, Pamela. Carol?
We have a few questions from Twitter. I'm going to start with Vani Sen, who says, this is for Pamela, can behaviors and attitudes taught to students in Colorado be taught in a classroom environment?
Oh, absolutely. I think in the example where I talked about Katie Malone in her class, that feelings charter, that it's that intentional creating of the climate, and I call it, you're going slow so you can go fast. Taking that time to build, to figure out how people want to feel when they're working together in that charter, developing that emotional literacy, and then really determining how specifically you're going to make that happen, builds that climate, and then it's a part of all of the learning that happens. And in the classroom, I've seen it used beautifully, and this is just one tool, there's so many. But you'll see something going on and you're like, hey, are we all able to feel this way? So-and-so wants to feel engaged right now. Is everybody feeling engaged? What do we need to do to handle this if we're not? These skills can be taught across the disciplines like Katie Malone does, talking about the ecology of the group. Yeah, it's very simple, actually.
Next question.
Okay, so one of the things that you guys have all kind of touched on in all of your talks is like we have this interconnectedness and everybody's going to have to come together for this kind of stuff to work. And another big thing whenever it comes to climate change and other kinds of ecological studies and things like this is these days is that it's becoming hyper-politicized. So my question to you, anybody on the panel that wishes to accept it, is how can we depoliticize some of these kind of talks and try to move on that way we can educate people on facts rather than getting backlash from political bias?
Michael, I'd almost ask you to answer that, as you have such a long history in working and spreading eco-literacy.
Yeah, I was having trouble following on the PA. Could you say that again?
Oh, yes. I was just saying, like, in the current political spectrum and then just historically, a lot of the problems that we get as far as backlash and stuff, especially recently, we see a lot of backlash because of political bias and other reasons. And my question to you would be, what are some ways that we can work to move past this political bias and to educate people on the facts rather than things that we see due to political reasons?
I think partly working locally, and the shrimp is one of my good examples of that, because the differences were really very, very profound to begin with about the ranchers, what the ranchers thought the students were like, what the ranchers thought the students thought the ranchers were like, and just getting together and working and the teacher talking to the students, for instance, on a very concrete level, saying, what would happen if somebody came into your room and told you couldn't play anymore with any of your toys? How would you feel? When the students began to get that sense of what it would be like to go onto the rancher's property and say, you're doing this wrong, you got to do it differently. So I think that kind of at a personal level, I think that I think a couple of other things. One of them is to realize that you're not going to convert everybody. That what we're aiming for is a kind of critical mass. In changing a school, for instance, one of the figures is suggested if you can get a third of the faculty in agreement, you can move ahead. But some of the people are never going to move ahead, and it's finally not a good use of your time to try to get them all to agree. So I think then that other thing is a question of how do you build your allies? How do you find the people who are already enough agreement with you that they're willing to work with you? And then as you can produce results, as you can demonstrate things, that can bring other people around. And then another thing, some of us were meeting in the College of Education yesterday. Sometimes you kind of get in it by the back door. Some of the important work that was being done in Arkansas, for instance, around rebuilding school buildings to make them more energy efficient, to make them more healthful, to make them a lot of other things, to make them environmentally more responsible. They began with the assumption that if they tried to sell this as an environmental project, it wouldn't get supported. And so they sold it as kids are going to be healthier, the school's going to save money, the kids are going to learn better. And then when they built the buildings and began to have them, then the teachers were beginning to say, but we can do more than that. We can also talk about how these environmentally responsible buildings are making a difference. And then they found that more teachers wanted to join them. They, in fact, were asked to go and speak to teachers at other schools. So it all began, but it really began by a kind of strategic design. This is what we want to accomplish. How do we describe what we want to accomplish in a way that people will hear us to begin with, and then how can we build from that?
Thank you.
I'd add one more point, too. A lot of the topics of Earth education are not really directly environmental in the first place, right? Home economics, social emotional learning, character education, which is actually quite celebrated in more conservative communities as well. So there are a lot of topics that get us closer to a more sustainable framing of education that are never overtly discussed as sustainability. In fact, the Bamboo School, one of the Worldwatch interns actually went there and wrote about that school for the report, and they found that sustainability was not in the language of the school, even though it was one of the most sustainable schools we wrote about, but it was all about social entrepreneurship and they just happened to do it in a way that was really focused on sustainable development, even if that wasn't the moniker.
I'll go in the opposite direction, because CSE is probably among the most politically divisive aspects of education one could ask for. It's horribly divided by politics. And yet, I think that I don't know that much about the experience of negotiating CSE in the United States, but I think this is borne out in the experience of other countries. And I think this relates also to what Pamela talked about with social emotional learning. The values that these kinds of education are teaching are helpful in working out the kind of disagreements that we have about whether to teach them. And their values of respect for other people's opinions, their values of talking out differences, their values of learning what motivates people to say what they say or to act the way they do. And I think what's really required is for us to not demonize our opposition, not say, well, you're just a climate denier or a science denier or whatever, to find ways to artfully use evidence, which in the case of CSE is incredibly powerful. It really just nails the case that these courses are good for almost everything that even the most conservative of parents would want their children to have. The ability to say no and to hear no, the ability to be intentional about their reproduction, the ability to be healthy in their romantic and sexual relationships. So I argue that one of the biggest problems with the promotion of CSE in schools is that actually parents who should normally be very, very favorable to them are themselves still a bit embarrassed. It's about sex. And I've found often that in the schools I've worked with and teachers I've worked with, bringing up CSE automatically sort of induces a kind of a gulp. And that we who are learning about these topics as we are today have something of an obligation to be courageous enough to speak up for them. And I think what we find, as Erik is pointing out in the less political areas, is you find, for example, is there anyone who wants to see more teen pregnancy in the world or in their community? Is teen pregnancy a good thing? No, we can all agree on that, so maybe we can start with that. Some would say, well, abstinence is the only thing I accept. And then you need to work with them and talk with them and say, well, abstinence is a good thing when it's possible and when people want to be abstinent. Let's talk about that and let's see if we can move from that conversation in a respectful way to include more things. And I think that kind of approach to the conversation, particularly at the local school level, in schools and PTA meetings and Board of Education meetings, can be successful, and it's the approach that we should take.
I just wanted to add, it made me think, you know, there's if you can find a way that there's something for everybody. And an example with our work is that things just really blew open about, I don't know, 7 years ago when this huge meta-analysis, almost 270,000 students, 250 some studies, and it showed all this great stuff about social and emotional learning and skills, but it was that point on what happens with those standardized test scores, the academic learning, even though that I think there's an argument to be made, and there is actually, that we get a lot more from teaching these social and emotional skills than we do in terms of life outcomes than we do with the cognitive skills. But when we could point out that you can do better on a test, you can actually speak to them, then more people came on board. And it's the same with the economic case. So I think finding in those discussions you're having that one thing that like you said, everybody can agree on. It's really powerful. You don't just keep ramming your head again, find that, sort of navigate around that obstacle that they're not buying into and come back to it through something they share.
Next question from the web.
All right, we have Sarah Sussman. Does the comprehensive sexuality education include education about gender and sexual orientation?
Absolutely. The best of them do. I mean, as I said, there's a range, but as I mentioned in the evolving, and this is an evolving concept, it's learned a lot from experience over the decades that it's been taught in schools. I'd venture to say a decade or two ago, this was not a big aspect of sexuality education, but the the kind of comprehensive sexuality education that's being promoted, not just in North America, not just in developed countries, but throughout the world by, as I mentioned, agencies like UNESCO and the United Nations Population Fund, which have both taken a big issue in this for obvious reasons, as well as the World Bank and others are promoting the idea that absolutely an essential element of comprehensive sexuality education is to learn to respect differences in sexual orientation, differences in expressions of sexuality, and to understand that these are not issues of abnormality, but issues of the way people are choosing when they are able to choose the way they express their sexuality intentionally, safely, and in good health. So I would say it's a fundamental component, at least in the ideal, and at least in the policies that are being promoted by this Latin American consortium that I mentioned in my talk of health and education ministers, I think of almost every country in Latin America, now being looked at by countries in Eastern Africa. So around the world, and very much if you go to the Netherlands or Belgium, which has a similar program, others in Northern Europe, definitely the whole range, LGBTQ, children are taught, I think really at the very, very youngest ages. Probably encounter some opposition as a result of that, but it's a core principle of comprehensive sexuality education, at least as it's evolving at this moment. So I think it's where it's not happening, it probably will be happening soon, in spite of probably some friction that it does cause.
All right, we have, here we go, Vani Sen. So again, Pamela Parker. Can children, I guess, be taught in an affordable way, or no, can these principles be taught in an affordable way to a large group of kids of various ages?
So multi-age group?
I guess on a broad scale, can what you address be brought forward on a broad scale and at different levels of learning?
Yeah, well, I think that anytime you have that systematic application that I talked about, the implementation throughout a school community, I'm assuming this is talking about in a school community, that you have all ages, in fact, everybody. I think it's Mark Brackett with the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence who talks about systematic implementation as everybody with a face is practicing and learning to embody these skills. But it's that, that multi-generational aspect within the school, and then also including the families, that you start seeing it develop. And then, of course, the mentoring that can happen within that setting, the activities that can be run by older students for younger students. I've actually, yes, in that systematic implementation, I think more than in any other way.
I have a question for you, Michael, and I think you address it somewhat in your presentation, but I kind of want more. It's the question of how do you navigate ecoliteracy so that it empowers rather than overwhelms? I mean, the science is so dire that is that hard to navigate, or is that have you found that is not?
I think what we found is that when it works is when kids are given the opportunity to do something, to find themselves making a decision, making a difference, and being recognized for having made the difference. So that I think it's always that, for us, that question of what can we do, whether it's asked literally or is in the back of their minds. I think that's when they, and there are numerous things that people can do. We're looking now at climate change education, and some of the schools locally, what the students are doing is they're doing projects where they're analyzing their local communities' climate plans, and it's just back to the fact that they're using their minds to apply something to a problem. And that they're doing it for somebody who wants to know what they think about it, who is in the position to make decisions because of what they think about it. So I think that that's probably over and over again, I think that doing something, and something at all grade levels, I mean, working in a garden, learning where food comes from, learning from that how food is distributed, and learning how food becomes a justice issue. All of those things, I think, over and over again in our experience, really it's that marriage of experience and intellectual theory. And I think that we found that either one of them alone doesn't work. People can get a lot of theory, they can know it, they can pass a test about it, but it doesn't affect them. And if they just go outside and do stuff, I mean, there's a place, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday, about the importance of play, the importance of unstructured play. That's real important, but for some of this, if you want to have an impact on what they do with the environment, there's got to be some way of connecting that to what they're learning. Having them experience it, having them create project-based learning is another big one where you begin with the problem. You say, here's the problem, as in some ways they did with the shrimp. Here are these shrimp, they're endangered. What can we do about it? And not be told, and here's the book, read the book, that'll tell you what to do about it, but we don't know what to do about it. Let's figure out what to do about it.
Yeah. Please.
Hi, my name is Scott Johnson. I'm a student here at Appalachian State University. My question is, as a member of the Student Government Association, am I loud enough, by the way? Okay. As a member of the Student Government Association here, what can we do to advocate and initiate Earth education here at Appalachian and at the local Boone level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's so much to choose from that I think, again, it depends on the students, on the teachers. Yesterday, Michael just referenced a talk that he and I had at the College of Education. There was organized by the educational professors, how do we start integrating sustainability into the College of Education? And so the answer for them is very different, I think, from the students, but I think depending on what inspires, that's your starting point, right? Where you can mobilize yourself and keep energetic, whether that's on social emotional learning or comprehensive sexuality education as an expansion of current conversations on campus, or on eco-literacy, or or if you're an economics major, maybe your hope is to start pushing the conversation to question exponential and perpetual growth. And it really depends on the students that are around the table, and obviously expanding that group around that table so that more and more priorities can be tackled.
If I can just add to that, something really wonderful is happening today and right now at Appalachian State University. You all are playing a big role in the release of a book that is, you can think of it as a kind of a brand. I'm going to say this because I think Erik probably wouldn't, but this concept of EarthEd, there's now like a little handbook with 63 some authors and 22 some chapters and sidebars, a wide range of things to choose from. I think it'd be really interesting if there's, in the student government here at Appalachian State, would think about, gee, this thing was launched here, and how nice that we have this partnership with this book and the Worldwatch Institute. I think it'd be great if you'd say, let's have a discussion about, is EarthEd a word, a term we might want to promote? Is it a concept we might want to promote? What would it look like? Ask everybody in the student government in the school to buy the book. It's online. I'm part of the Worldwatch. Or check it out from the library, yes, of course. But, to get this read and talked about, I mean, I myself, having read much, not maybe all the book, but it's extremely rich. And I think it would be great if maybe after we all go back to DC and the speakers all go to Colorado and California and where we're all from, if the school could, if a student body could say, let's have a conversation about this, let's read a lot of this book and maybe have a little book group about it and see whether this is something we could promote and maybe even to some extent own, since the thing was launched here. That's just a spontaneous idea, but I love that you asked the question, and I think there is incredible potential for students here to take this on and see where it leads, because it's just the concept we're sort of throwing out there in a bottle and hoping the world takes up. The world's going to need this century. There's no doubt about it.
May I? Immediately when you asked your question, I'm kind of the relationship girl here, but I started, I immediately think, well, what are the relationships that you need to cultivate to get here? And in one of my slides, I mentioned something called restorative practices. And one part of restorative practices is they can be used to build connection and understanding. And I immediately pictured you hosting, I'm happy to train you virtually, some connection circles where you brought key players together from, people that think, oh, we don't really need it, and people that are gung-ho, and then people that are undecided in the middle, and bring them together and pass a talking piece. It can be a really not too foofy talking piece, very serious thing, and pass it around and have some prompts that you talk to people about their story and why it would be important to them, and start learning why people care or why they don't, and then that would help you. These connection circles can really help you develop a plan to go forward, but what it really does is it helps build those key relationships that you need from the stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a follow-up question. Am I allowed to kind of do that? Okay.
Sure.
We've had a lot of really great conversations about sustainability. We have 2 cabinet positions open in our administration for social sustainability and environmental sustainability. So we've definitely had lots of good conversations around that, and we can definitely continue that. I would love to know, what can we do for tangible change, for definite transparency of sustainability? What can we do on campus that students will, events-wise, what can they say, oh, yeah, that's that sustainability event. Let's go over and check it out. What can we do for, to be visible? We've had so many great conversations, and I definitely want to continue to do so. But here at Appalachian State, we've had so many of those, but we haven't, implemented it. And personally, we just had an upcoming new administration. Our last election, we got some really good candidates in office now. But I'd really like to know, what can we do for tangible change? What can we do to advocate to students on a personal basis where they see it and not just hear about it?
I would actually push back. So if 53% of the student body now is coming because of their interest in sustainability, I think you can bring this to a whole new level. Right there, in an earlier State of the World, there was a chapter by one of the authors who wrote about post-growth education in higher education. But he wrote about choice editing, right? And there's a lot of things that have to go on below the radar, under conscious level, right? And it's going to take leadership of students to make that happen, right? So, so much of the sustainability conversation on campus revolves around infrastructure, around buildings, around renewable energy, around food waste, around events. But we need to go to the next level now. We need to recode the curriculum, right? And App State is already a leader on that, but it's got far to go, right? We need to understand that, again, to pick on economics, because Josh is in my line of sight. I mean, we need to recognize that economics, how it's taught, has to evolve for life on a full world. Agricultural sciences, business education, government, English, everything needs to be rethought out now that we know where we are in history, in a place where our population is starting to, will have to start shrinking, even if that's delayed by a century. It's going to get smaller. Our economy is going to get smaller. We're going to have to adapt to a lot of things, and that's going to need innovation, and university has always been a center of innovation. And so having these opportunities to really recode the curriculum would be, where if I, was on campus and could, answer this and follow up rather than just parachute in for a day, it would be on curriculum where I would advocate for really putting a lot of energy.
Thank you.
You might consider what kind of targets could the students urge on the administration in terms of both the infrastructure and the curricular thing. So if the students are involved in saying, let's collectively assert ourselves in a way of like, students can accomplish a lot when they demand things from administrators, and I don't want to suggest that what we need is a conflict situation here, but having gone to college in the 60s and 70s, it could often be very effective. And if students could have a conversation where they said, we want to make sure, we want to be able to survey, for example, everyone who goes to this school and hear 93% say that they feel that this school helps provide them good access to sexual and reproductive health care. I think that's a critical thing. It'll be wonderful to see 0 unintended pregnancy on App State campus. That's just one small thing that I care a lot about, but it could also be emissions quotas. It could be, how little food waste you get to. And just, gathering around, having discussions around that. I don't know whether that would qualify as tangible events and tangible results, but that sort of thing can create the dialogue that then lends itself to the kind of changes that Erik's talking about.
Thank you.
And I know I'm not on the panel, but I just want to reinforce what they said, because we did attend, or with some of the faculty and staff, they made it very clear that they're open to listening to what students want and what career paths they want to take and what skills they still need. So I would say definitely speak with your professors, because they're waiting to hear what you want. So we have not a question, but a comment from the Green program. They say, yes, applying real-life experiences to education is the key to climate change and sustainability education, and that their students work on capstone projects and use innovation to develop solutions to the world's most pressing issues. So kind of a plug for them, but maybe a chance to respond to what you see as the role of the experience of a project rather than just a typical classroom setting.
I'm happy to comment, and everyone as well. I mean, some of the chapters really focus on real-world experience. I mean, I know Ecoliteracy has some great examples on that, but also the deeper learning chapter. Really, I mean, from the opening example and throughout, the students are going directly into their communities and identifying problems and then acting on them, right? And figuring out what's the best way forward, and let's do it. And that sometimes happens as kind of lobbying. Other times it's setting up an actual project, and that has the two benefits. I mean, it really is a strong way to teach people and empower people, but it also has real-world effects and real-world benefits, and then that hopefully would be that positive spiral.
I was just going to say that it's when you can connect through those projects to a feeling and to this sense of purpose. That's what builds the intrinsic motivation to then continue to apply purpose. It gives meaning and purpose to learning, I think, by getting deep into it and not necessarily being, told what the answer is, and being able to engage with it on an emotional level.
In CSE, there's a whole literature on the idea that it's not so much what you teach in the course, but what actually occurs in the teaching that is the most valuable. And I've experienced this myself, not just in educational meetings, but in community meetings in developing countries and elsewhere around issues of reproduction and sexuality, that when you bring people of both genders together to talk about these topics, it's often the first time that people have done that across genders, and it's amazing to see what often happens. I think a lot of the unhealthiness of sexuality in the world comes from the fact that males often learn about it from each other and talk about it among themselves and don't really have an opportunity to interact with females at every point of their lives. The stills I showed about the schools in the Netherlands came from videos that are available on a PBS website. They did a feature on this particular set of schools in the Netherlands. And I just thought it was really beautiful to see, and I've, again, witnessed this working myself, where young people start talking about how it feels to feel affection and how it feels to like someone, what they do like and what they don't like. I have seen people grow from that and change their attitudes about sexuality and gender by virtue of having those kinds of conversations. And I suspect it's true well beyond CSE, that just simply engaging in doing this deep work about how we relate to each other and hearing how other people feel, what they like, what they don't like, what they want, what they don't want, it changes the thinking in a way that probably is much better than seeing diagrams of reproductive organs and examples of contraceptives on blackboards or on a screen. So again, it's this process of being able to talk about feelings. Males particularly need to work on that, and they get a lot of good work out of that in these kinds of well-designed courses.
Greg?
Right. The perception of the North Carolina legislature is that the main purpose of education is to prepare you for the jobs that will be in the market when you finish your education. And I agree that a large portion of education is to prepare you for life beyond school. I have this perception that living on a finite planet, and with the rise of automation, we're going to have a larger fraction of people and a larger fraction of our time which is not engaged in producing things. Does the idea of eco-education, does it help us to understand how to spend that time when we are not physically engaged in manufacturing shirts or automobiles?
Absolutely, it does. There's a really powerful chapter on vocational training for the eco-technical transition. And we'll actually watch a short video by the author Nancy Lee Wood in the afternoon. But she really maps out some key job paths that are not being trained for right now. Everything from restorative agriculture to conflict mediation actually as one. But there will be this crisis that's coming will open up new job opportunities, as strange as that sounds, and will require new skills, which are not being taught mostly. I also do not think that we're entering a world of robots and displaced people. Those robots need energy, and there's going to be much more limits on that. I mean, even Kurt Vonnegut was writing about a displaced labor force in the 70s because of the growth of robots stealing jobs. I actually personally think many more of us will be returning to sufficiency farming as not a sole pathway forward for survival, but as a comprehensive multi-generational household strategy for survival. It's worked throughout most of our history as humans, having some sorts of barterable skills or revenue generating skills now, and supporting that and balancing that with the direct growth of food, which can sustain the family even in the worst of times. So I think having, again, home economics is more important than ever. Again, to guard ourselves against the toxic food environment that we live in, but also to get ready for the shifts in what is available, what pathways, career pathways, what food access will be available in a hot and very constrained future.
And I think beyond the question of jobs, I think that whatever we can do to prepare ourselves and help other people prepare for a world which is not as job-oriented. And in fact, some ways the sexuality, the social and emotional learning, the arts, all of those areas in which growth is possible without material growth, so that we're not putting a greater strain on the planet's resources, but we're not also feeling that we're stuck, that we can grow, that we can develop, and that we can develop into healthier and better people, better living people, happier people, outside of needing to, again, put that strain on resources and put that strain on the climate. I think thinking harder about that one is going to be an important one.